Kalorama, a Recorded Books Highbridge imprint, presents The Drive for Dollars: How Fiscal Politics Shaped Urban Freeways and Transformed American Cities, by Brian D. Taylor, Eric A. Morris, and Jeffrey R. Brown. Read by Derek Dysart. Publisher's note: this audiobook contains references to visuals present in the print and e-book editions of the book. Preface. Our research on this book commenced 36 years ago, meaning its gestation was about as long as it took to construct most of the interstate highway system. Brian Taylor was a graduate student in city and regional planning and civil engineering at UC Berkeley when he was hired in 1985 by Dr. David W. Jones, Jr. to assist with the study of the California Department of Transportation, or Caltrans. It focused on Caltrans' uneasy, protracted transition from a freeway-building organization to one charged with managing multimodal transportation systems. This research entailed an extensive survey of Caltrans engineers, many of whom, at the ends of their careers, expressed melancholy. Engineering careers that had begun with the heady excitement of building an enormous modern system of superhighways were ending with a profound sense of ambivalence. California's planned freeway system was less than half completed, but construction had by the 1980s slowed to a crawl. Cutting freeways through neighborhoods had proven exceedingly controversial, and community resistance to them was waxing. Freeways, which had initially been seen as promising for finally solving vexing congestion problems, were increasingly clogged with traffic. Los Angeles and many other California cities had become infamous for their smog, much of it attributed to motor vehicle emissions. Funding for freeways, plentiful in the 1960s, was now in the 1980s in short supply. And California policymakers, who had charged Caltrans engineers with building a great freeway system for the future, were pulling back on their commitment to freeways and to the engineers who designed and built them. How had this near-universal enthusiasm for and extraordinary commitment to freeways occurred? And how had the public charged to these engineers to blanket the country, including its cities, with high-speed freeways so quickly unraveled? These were the questions that motivated our early work on this book, and the answers, time and time again, came back to money. Brian graduated from Berkeley and went on to work as a transportation planner for the San Francisco Bay Area Metropolitan Transportation Commission, or MTC, in the late 1980s. He focused on the planning and finance of public transit systems. During his time there, he saw repeatedly how the politics of public finance exerted more influence over transportation policy outcomes than the carefully crafted plans ostensibly guiding the work of the MTC. After a few years, Brian entered the urban planning PhD program at UCLA. There, he wrote his dissertation, under the tutelage of Professor Martin Wachs, to whom this book is dedicated, on how fiscal politics both shaped the design of urban freeways and public transit systems and contributed to their chronic financial woes, entitled When Finance Leads Planning: The Influence of Public Finance on Transportation Planning and Policy in California. Early in his academic career, first as a faculty member at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and then back at UCLA, Brian continued his research on the politics of freeway and public transit finance. In the course of this work, he hired Jeffrey Brown, then an urban planning graduate student, to work on 2 transportation finance research projects. Out of these projects, Jeffrey wrote an award-winning master's thesis entitled Trapped in the Past: The Gas Tax and Highway Finance, and an award-winning doctoral dissertation entitled The Numbers Game: The Politics of the Federal Surface Transportation Program. Both projects spurred subsequent research by Jeffrey, now a faculty member at Florida State University, on early urban freeway planning and the politics of transportation finance. In 2005, Brian began working with urban planning graduate student Eric Morris, who was commencing a career shift from Hollywood television writer to transportation academic, as so many do. While at UCLA, Eric wrote a transportation history master's thesis, From Horsepower to Horsepower, the External Costs of Transportation in the 19th Century City, which examined the dawn of the motor age in U.S. cities. At that point, Eric, Jeffrey, and Brian began research together on this book, examining how the drive for dollars altered early plans for urban freeways and profoundly shaped American cities and travel in them. This work continued with Eric's graduation and move to a faculty position at Clemson University. While this book weaves together years of research by Brian, Jeffrey, and Eric, it is an entirely collaborative enterprise. We each contributed to every chapter in an equal research partnership. Our names are listed alphabetically by last name and do not indicate any ranking of contribution to the final product. Most of what is laid out in these pages are drawn from original research, sometimes conducted in collaboration with others. Finally, the work that went into this exploration of the power of finance was more than matched by the pleasure that all concerned reaped from producing it. We hope the listener feels they have gotten their money's worth as well. Part 1. Overview and Introduction. 1. Cities, Cars, and Freeways. A modern urban planner, equipped with a time machine and sent back to the dawn of the 20th century, would find her world turned upside down. As curious as it may be, given her 21st century perspective, in the early decades of the 1900s, most urban thinkers considered the automobile and suburbanization not the banes of urban civilization, but their potential saviors. Unlike horses, autos didn't kick, bite, or trample children. They didn't deposit thousands of pounds of manure on city streets each day. With horses and their droppings gone, trillions of flies would never be hatched, which would slow the spread of dangerous diseases like tuberculosis. Hundreds of decomposing horse carcasses would no longer litter American streets each day. The low growl of the internal combustion engine would be less grating than the clanking of iron horseshoes on pavements. Many observers believed that traffic crashes and fatalities would fall, thanks to vehicles that lacked often obstreperous minds of their own. Congestion would be reduced as well. Autos traveled at high speeds. They were maneuverable, particularly laterally, and they took up less street space than the horse-powered vehicles that preceded them. Autos also accelerated quickly, a boon in stop-and-go traffic. Autos seemed likely to ease parking problems. They were considerably smaller than horse-drawn vehicles, which took up about the same amount of space as a modern delivery truck. Auto storage was a relatively antiseptic affair compared with the business of housing the horse. Urban stables were one of the 19th century's most noxious land uses. Moreover, autos could be left at the curb with less risk of theft and could be counted on not to attack passers-by. Autos did not need to be periodically fed and watered. They promised to be easier to repair. It was far simpler to fix a flat tire than a horse's broken leg. Finally, numerous publications calculated that automobiles would be less expensive to own and operate than horse-drawn vehicles. Many observers at the time also believed that perhaps the greatest benefits of all would come from an auto-driven reshaping of urban form. Many considered cities a great font of social ills. Cities were severely overcrowded. In 1900, the Lower East Side of New York reached a population density of 350,000 persons per square mile, versus 27,500 for modern-day New York. Cities featured inadequate housing, immigrants with un-American values, abysmal sanitation, and vice of all sorts, particularly drunkenness. These mixed together to form what was seen by many observers as a dangerous cocktail of crime, disease, poverty, irreligiosity, and moral degeneration. Reform of the city was seen by many as hopeless. The more promising solution, rather than fix the city, abandon it. Suburbs, on the other hand, promised a lifestyle seen as more in keeping with traditional American values and mores. Lower density living would be more pastoral in character. A stout American yeomanry would replace the teeming urban proletariat. Individual plots offered space for children's play far from the malign influences of the urban street. The light and air that would come with detached housing would reduce disease. Middle-class suburbanization in America was not new. It had been proceeding rapidly at least since the introduction of the horse-drawn streetcar in the 1850s, and perhaps even since the 1820s with the opening of steam-powered ferry service from Manhattan to Brooklyn. However, the auto promised to accelerate suburbanization dramatically. The public was also widely frustrated with the electric streetcar, the predominant mode for longer distance travel in cities. Service was often unreliable. Vehicles were frequently crowded and dilapidated, and the streetcar companies were castigated in the press as greedy, uncaring monopolists. The auto, by contrast, promised comfort, privacy, convenience, and independence. It would liberate travelers from the tyranny of fixed routes and schedules, and allow land development away from fixed streetcar tracks. As auto ownership trickled down to the middle classes, whole new segments of the public would be able to acquire an essential, perhaps the essential, component of what would soon become the American dream: a detached, single-family home on its own plot of land within easy driving distance of jobs, shopping, and culture. Two things are remarkable about this vision of the auto's promise. The first is that, in many ways, it has been realized far beyond its proponents' wildest dreams. Suburbanization was greatly facilitated by the privately owned auto. Most Americans today live in suburbs, where ownership of detached single-family homes is the province of the many, not the privilege of the few. Fatalities from crashes were greatly reduced, at least on per capita and per mile basis. In many ways, sanitation and public health were greatly improved. For example, rates of tuberculosis and other communicable diseases dropped sharply after horse-drawn transportation and the flies it nurtured were eliminated. Auto ownership did trickle down to the working classes and even the poor. As a group, modern Americans enjoy greater mobility, with greater speed, more convenience, and greater comfort than any people in history. The other remarkable thing is the degree to which this vision has simultaneously been discredited. Today, automobility is viewed by many as a poisoned chalice. Contemporary thinking largely focuses not on promoting the auto but on reining it in, pricing it, taxing it, regulating it, replacing its propulsion system, or supplanting it altogether with alternate modes of travel. How, in the space of a century, did the auto go from the darling of urbanists to their bête noire? There are a number of reasons for the auto's fall from grace. We now know that autos emit pollutants about which early 20th century planners were ignorant. We have seen that congestion cannot be tamed by simply building more roads. Perhaps most importantly, we have come full circle on urbanization. Rather than promoting suburbanization, modern planners generally seek to check it. Instead of turning our backs on cities populated disproportionately by people of color in favor of developing the more homogeneous suburban fringe, many planners and governments across the country endorse limits on peripheral development and promote urban infill and regeneration projects. As tools that permit sprawl, autos are now blamed for urban decline, rather than being hailed as its remedy. If the auto is the mustache-twirling villain in this current narrative, it has a henchman: the urban freeway. This innovation was, like the auto, widely hailed in the middle third of the 20th century as a cure for urban transportation ills. Indeed, while some consider the freeway a triumph and others a tragedy, and we maintain the story has elements of both, few would deny that freeways have had an outsized effect on American urbanization and transportation. The freeways that now encircle and penetrate America's cities are the products of an ostensibly rural-focused program, the Dwight D. Eisenhower system of interstate and defense highways. One of the largest public works projects in world history, the interstate systems builders acquired an amount of land equivalent in size to the state of Delaware. As we will see, the system's rural orientation is responsible for many of the features of urban freeways that have resulted in the contemporary hostility toward them. The intercity portions of the system are for the most part regarded as benign and even beneficial. They have revolutionized rural and small-town life compared to the age when the farmer was stuck in the mud. They have permitted the integration of previously remote areas into the nation's economy. They have fostered fast and reliable shipment of goods that has contributed to substantial decreases in production and distribution costs, which has helped dramatically increase productivity. Disruption due to land condemnation was generally manageable in the open spaces of the countryside. Rural freeway routing was comparatively non-controversial. Battles were largely waged by rural states and small cities and towns that courted rather than shunned connection to the network. Being bypassed by the interstates was often seen as a municipal death sentence, on par with being left off the railroad network a century earlier. This notion of interstate highways creating small-town winners and losers is widespread. For instance, the popular 2006 Disney Pixar film Cars centered on life in the small town of Radiator Springs, which began to decline when the new interstate freeway passed it by. The urban portions of the interstates also confer substantial benefits. Admirers of the system, such as Cox and Love, have pointed out that urban freeways have saved their users immense amounts of travel time. This assertion assumes substantial growth in personal and commercial vehicle travel, even in the absence of freeway construction. Such analyses rest on a very large set of assumptions because, of course, it is hard to know what travel patterns would have been like in a world without freeways. They have cut shipping costs and permitted logistical innovations such as just-in-time delivery for producers and ever-faster deliveries of packages for consumers. They have improved access to a host of activities and permitted considerable freedom of location choice for both residents and firms. Compared to urban arterials and local streets, they have drastically reduced road deaths on a per-vehicle mile traveled basis. And urban freeways have arguably reduced congestion compared to a world where all traffic moved on lower-speed, lower-capacity surface streets. However, when many observers today look at urban freeways, they see a planning disaster. To those who live, work, or play near them, freeways are rivers of noise and pollution that cascade through the urban landscape. They are charged with destroying neighborhoods, particularly low-income Black and Latinx communities, and with being wedges that divide many more. Freeways are considered auto magnets that have induced travel and heightened congestion rather than relieving and dissipating it. They are seen as enabling wasteful, auto-dependent lifestyles that have fueled our addiction to oil, choked off alternative forms of transportation, harmed environments, and hastened climate change. They are blamed for facilitating suburbanization, which opponents charge has encroached on precious open space and exacerbated economic and racial segregation, even as it saps central cities of their economic, social, and cultural vibrancy. What makes freeways such fascinating subjects of study is that all of these claims, both positive and negative, have merit. For better and worse, freeways are the centerpiece of most U.S. metropolitan transportation systems, a feature that distinguishes American cities from almost all others. While many cities around the globe have some grade-separated, limited-access roadways, The metropolitan freeway networks that blanket most large American cities, extending into the very hearts of their downtowns, are conspicuously absent elsewhere. No other nation relies on freeways for such a large share of metropolitan travel. Comprising only a tiny fraction, 6%, of urban street and road lane mileage, freeways nationally carry over one-third, 36%, of all urban vehicle travel. Freeways actually play a smaller role outside of cities. Less than a third, 30%, of all rural vehicle travel is on freeways. These statistics refer to lane miles and vehicle travel, respectively, on interstates and other freeways and expressways. There is no doubt that the unique land use patterns of 20th century American cities, comparatively low densities and with much of the dynamism on the periphery, can be traced in part to freeways. Whether embracing or vilifying them, no one can dismiss the freeway's significance. To understand the myriad effects of freeways on American cities and travel today, we ask, were freeways the best, or even a good, way to accommodate burgeoning urban vehicle travel? Were, and are, there better ways to manage motor vehicle travel in cities? Might smaller, slower speed freeways configured in denser networks have done the job with less disruption and displacement? Why did initial plans for just such networks evolve into the much different systems we have today? How did we come to invest so heavily and rely so extensively on metropolitan freeways when so many other countries did not? What impact have the freeways had on our cities and society? And finally, and most importantly in our analysis, how did the drive for dollars to fund our ambitious freeway systems affect the scale and routing of metropolitan freeways and, in turn, cities and travel in them? We argued that clues to these questions lie in the not-too-distant past, when early civil engineers and urban planners began planning cities with few preconceived notions about the best ways to accommodate growing motor vehicle use. Proceeding through time, we find further clues about freeways, motorization, and their effects on American urban development when we examine why the roads those planners and engineers initially sketched out were not ultimately built as planned. To do this, we build on prior work while adding much new material. We bring previously neglected aspects of the story of fiscal politics and metropolitan freeways into focus, while dismissing some of the more commonly propagated canards. Previous books on freeways have typically taken one of several forms. First are the histories of the interstate system written for lay audiences, like Lewis's Divided Highways, McNichol's The Roads That Built America, The Incredible Story of the U.S. Interstate System, and Swift's The Big Roads, The Untold Story of the Engineers, Visionaries, and Trailblazers who created the American superhighways. These are readable and informative, but as popular histories, they tended to focus on narrative storytelling and emphasize interesting backstories and personalities of those behind the interstates. This can come at the expense of analyses of the structural, institutional, economic, political, and other underlying forces behind freeway development. Second are scholarly histories of the interstate system, notably Rose's Interstate, Express Highway Politics, and Seeley's Building the American Highway System, Engineers and Policymakers. Both books were written, and Rose's was updated, in the final dozen years of the interstate era. They focus principally on interest group politics and the political evolution of the federal highway program, the collaborations between states and the federal government in highway development, the significant figures of the freeway era, and how the culture of civil engineering profoundly, and in many cases naively, shaped early highway policy. These were important and insightful contributions, but they focus less on fiscal politics and urban freeway planning than we do. A third, and considerably larger, set of books examined freeways through more normative lenses. The largest share have titles like Road to Ruin, A Critical View of the Federal Highway Program, Superhighway, Super Hoax, Highways to Nowhere, The Pavers and the Paved, The Real Cost of America's Highway Program, and Asphalt Nation, How the Automobile Took Over America and How We Can Take It Back. They were mostly penned amidst the rise of social and environmental activism in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and were harshly critical of the effects of freeways on cities, the folly of auto dependence, the arrogant indifference of the highway builders, and the power of the auto, oil, and construction industries in advancing the freeway program. The yin to these freeway critiques' yang is a smaller body of work, including America's Highways, 1776 to 1976, L.A. Freeway, An Appreciative Essay, Driving Forces, The Automobile, Its Enemies, and the Politics of Mobility, and The Best Investment a Nation Ever Made, a tribute to the Dwight D. Eisenhower system of interstate and defense highways. These works offered spirited defenses of automobility and freeways as a counter-narrative to the many critiques proffered by opponents. Fourth are more recent works that examined the racial and equity dimensions of freeway development. These most often focused on the displacement of families and businesses and the carving up of non-white and, in particular, black communities in order to route freeways through cities. These books include Highway Robbery, Transportation Racism and New Routes to Equity, Interstate, Highway Politics and Policy since 1939, The Folklore of the Freeway, Race and Revolt in the Modernist City, and Dixie Highway, Road Building and the Making of the Modern South. Ostensibly the third edition of Rose's sole-authored book, published in 1979 and updated in 1990, this co-authored book adds substantial work by Moll on race, displacement, and metropolitan freeway development, including freeway revolts in black communities and elsewhere, as well as efforts to tear down particularly unpopular freeway segments. They examined highway construction as an instrument of racial segregation, the intentional use of urban freeway construction for slum clearance, the explicit routing of freeways to separate black and white communities, and the occasional successful but more often unsuccessful efforts to oppose the routing of freeways through black and Latinx areas. Fifth and finally are works on metropolitan freeway planning more broadly. Schwartz and Foster, in his 1981 book, From Streetcar to Superhighway, American City Planners and Urban Transportation, 1900 to 1940, argued that freeways were the products of urban planning at the time. Schwartz wrote, "Since urban freeways then carried the city planners' collective seal of approval, there is little merit in the idea that the 1956 Act, funding the interstate system, subverted the planners' collective wisdom." Demento and Ellis, in their book, Changing Lanes, Visions and Histories of Urban Freeways, disagreed. They detailed architects, highway engineers, and planners' competing visions for freeways and the roles they ought to play in cities, a competition largely won by the engineers. We agree with Demento and Ellis that the freeway networks eventually constructed in most U.S. cities were most emphatically not products of city planners' collective wisdom. Quite the contrary. We will show how and why decisions made about how to pay for the freeway program put engineers in the driver's seat and consequently change the character and impacts of freeways on cities. While the authors of these previous books varied widely in terms of their analysis of the motivating forces behind freeways, ranging from the popular rise of automobility to the arc of highway engineering science, to the behind-the-scenes power of the highway lobby, to the machinations of downtown and suburban land development interests, to systemic racism, with only a few exceptions, they all tend to treat freeways largely as interchangeable commodities. The key issues in most previous works are the decisions about through which communities the freeways should pass, or whether to build them at all. They rarely focus on whether urban freeways, with 160-foot widths and 75 miles per hour design speeds, must be such enormous invasive facilities in the first place. We will show that the urban freeways we know today were far from inevitable, as auto use has grown rapidly in many other developed countries, largely in the absence of metropolitan freeway networks. As for conspiracies, though it is tempting to assign
Sample complete.